Yeah, I'm going to try to explain two-way data binding. I didn't get it for the longest time, and the documentations weren't much help for the longest time. An empty activity is fine. Let's start by turning on the build features, namely data binding, right? And we might as well add view binding in there as well. Sync it. Now let's create our view model. Main view model. Obviously, you should extend view model, and we'll just have our mutable live data. Let's make it an integer, and I'm going to call it hour because we'll be using a time picker for this example. In my default constructor, I'm going to initialize the hour value to 0 just to avoid any nulls later on. Let's put a getter and a setter for that. Next up, we'll lay out a view. And then let's set up this layout with data binding. And then we'll complete the setup in the main activity. For this example, we'll also set up our text view to observe the changes in the data. Our button will cause that change. This will update our hour data model by incrementing it by 1. And now a quick demonstration. Alright, so as you can see, our text view is observing changes to the data or the model. And every time we click the button, the updated change is reflected here in a text view. Then let's add our time picker. Wrap content. Now let's add the custom attribute that we're going to be using. We'll call it Android:hour. The time picker needs to know how to respond to changes in the hour in our view model. So we'll describe a setter for it. When the view is loaded, it'll call this setter to initialize the hour on it. Now if we increment it, let's say 3 a.m., and then we change the configuration of our view, we can see that it gets set at 3 a.m. Oh, well, now notice that while we can change the hour with this button, changing the hour in the time picker is not reflected into the data. This is because we need two-way data binding for this to work. To turn on two-way data binding, we'll want to just add an equal sign right here. To finalize our two-way data binding setup, we need a getter, a way for this time picker to give us the data when it changes it inside, right? So if we mess around with the hand of the time, it changes the hour, and we get that change back to us as data in our view model. And to do that, we need to set up an inverse binding adapter, right? It'll look like this. Yeah. And so this will work as our getter. Now that's well and good. However, we need a way to notify when this getter should be called. And to do that, we need another binding adapter, but this time for the listener. This helps us bind an on-time change listener for the time picker to our inverse binding adapter, right? So whenever the time picker changes its time, we will trigger our on change on our inverse binding listener, which corresponds to our binding adapter. Now the naming here is exact because we need to keep the name of our attribute that we decided, and we need to also add attribute change here. This is how Android knows that this corresponds to a listener for our inverse binding adapter. And now we can see that while the button can change our live data, so can our time picker, which is appropriate. Right? And that's pretty much explains two-way data binding in a nutshell. The important bits were um, our inverse binding adapter and setting up a listener for it. Very simple. Okay, so a bit of a postscript here. I realized that something interesting happens if I comment out my getter and listener here and I try to run it. Usually it should crash, right? However, this time it doesn't. Actually, it still works without those things. And I think the reason is that because we named it hour and it corresponds to a getter and a setter on the view object itself, the time picker object, uh, Android just knows how to, set up the behavior to give us our mutable live data exactly as it corresponds to the time picker. So it's able to, set up uh, bindings in such a way that we get two-way data binding automatically. And I think the reason again is because we called it hour. If we called it something else that time picker doesn't really understand, and so Android doesn't really understand, then we would certainly need to set up our two-way data binding as I've helped show here, right? And just for completion, let's go ahead and do this, right? And so we will also call this time. And then if we run this, if I'm right, we should get back to where we were before. All right, excellent. Take care, y'all.